We're very excited to be presenting this panel today on gang policing, gang enforcement, gang law, gang trials, gang documentation, and everything else having to do with the creeping and unjust legal structures that govern gang designation in America. With me today, I'd like to introduce Eric Nielsen, who's the Associate Professor of Liberal Arts at the University of Richmond, Andrea Dennis, who's the John Bird Martin Chair of Law at the University of Georgia School of Law. Together, those two have co-authored Rap on Trial. We also have with us John Hamasaki, who is a civil rights and criminal defense attorney working on a particularly high-profile case right now relating to these issues, which we're going to hear about. So welcome. Thank you all so much for being here with us. We really, really appreciate you talking about this really hot topic. For those of you just tuning in who are not completely manic on Twitter like me, Now This also just put out a video about 10 minutes ago relating to the impact of some of the issues we're going to be talking about today on the lives of ordinary people. So I would encourage you, after you fully enjoy the presentation we have here for you, I would advise you to check out the Now This video because it's some powerful stuff. So I'd like to kind of dive right in with a little bit of a landscape overview. We've all heard, I think Andrea before this call was mentioning that she was just talking to a group of students in Georgia who'd never heard about gang databasing. And so many of us had never really heard about what the legal landscape of gang policing and prosecution really looks like. Some people think it's like something that's sort of reserved for the bad guys, so we don't really need to worry about it. So I'd love to dive into the darker and more shocking truth and ask you, Eric, to kind of walk us through what's happening in the world of gang prosecutions more broadly, and also touch on how these prosecutions could ever relate back to the music industry.
Okay. Well, over the last 15 years or so, we've seen a significant rise in the formation of gang units across the country. That's had significant ramifications for the communities of color that are often the targets of the surveillance and harassment of these units. And I think we're going to talk a little bit more about that here, but what we've focused on in particular is the way gang units have used rap lyrics to establish gang membership, gang association. And it's happening at an alarming rate. I mean, what we see, for example, is that the number of these cases, and what I'm referring to is cases in which rap lyrics or rap videos are introduced as evidence at some stage of the criminal legal process, whether it's to inform investigations, whether it's to secure indictments, or in many cases at trial. And what we've seen is that these cases have become far more common. And it's not a coincidence, I don't think, that the rise of gang units in police departments across the country has tracked almost perfectly with the rise of these cases. It's partly to do with these gang units themselves and often social media too. And I think we'll get to that, the extent to which these gang units are relying heavily on people's social media presence in order to establish, again, perceived gang affiliation. What we see in the cases that Andrea and I have written about in our book is what we see is that police and prosecutors have become very bold in the ways in which they are introducing rap lyrics. So the most common scenario that we've found is where police will introduce, say, a violent rap lyric, and they will introduce it, say, as evidence of a confession. So if there's a crime and you've been accused of it, and afterwards you wrote a rap lyric, they'll introduce it, and if it mentions violence, they say, hey, look, 2 + 2 = 4. He's accused of violence. This is a violent rap lyric, even though rap lyrics are, in many cases, by genre convention, violent, right? Even though these are often stock lyrics, and we see case after case where the lyrics do not actually map to any specific crime. It's just sort of generalized violence. That's the most common, where they're introduced as evidence of a defendant's involvement in some underlying crime. But what we're also seeing, and this is starting to tie into gang units for sure, is we're also starting to see true threats cases, or cases in which the lyrics themselves are the crime, and they're charged often as terroristic threats. And we're starting to see more and more of those cases. One, which definitely had a sort of gang membership was part of the case, involved a young man named Jamal Knox from Pittsburgh. He recorded his version of the iconic NWA song, Can I Curse? Fuck the Police. And
I think we can curse for the purposes of both quoting lyrics and expressing our feelings on this topic.
Okay, yes, got it. Which was bullshit. So
just jumping right in there, Eric.
Yeah, there we go. So, he was using the song as a form of protest. He did identify a couple of police officers by name, but the short version of this is he was tried for communicating a terroristic threat, and he was incarcerated for it. He was convicted and incarcerated. And so we've seen that, and we've also seen, and this is where maybe I'll leave off for now, we see in the majority of these cases, I've probably testified in maybe 10, I've worked on maybe 60 of them. The vast majority do have some gang connection that often that police and prosecutors are trying to establish, because especially in places like California, that allows them to pursue a gang enhancement, which can often take a charge that might carry a few years sentence and turn it into something that can carry 10, 15 years or more. And that becomes a very potent tool for prosecutors, if for no other reason than it helps them compel plea bargains. So we're seeing, the landscape is that we're seeing the rise of gang units, we're seeing them essentially criminalize an art form, and we're seeing a lot of young men, almost exclusively young men of color, in prison as a result.
Thank you for that. I actually want to kind of drill down on what we're talking about when we talk about gangs, because I think that for someone who's not as steeped in the topic, they may assume that when we refer to people charged with gang crimes, that we mean like the stereotypical like 90s TV show gangbanger, as opposed to the far more creeping definition that seems to be employed these days. I mean, we're talking about people who may very well have a group of friends, but not actually be members of any form of criminal street gang, be charged for something as simple as a song. And not just charged, but criminalized on the basis of race and culture in a far broader and more creeping way. I will say, I want to just quickly touch on, like, the definition of a gang is like a really low bar. At least I remember in California, it's like 3 or more people with a unifying symbol who have engaged in illegal behavior. So if like me and my friends who are on the volleyball team, you know, graffiti the next school over, technically we're a gang. But a bunch of white girls are never going to get charged for being a gang, even though they fit the definition. And I want to talk about the broader and more sort of implicitly and explicitly biased structure here. So Andrea, can you talk to us more about the criminalization of culture and the creeping racial and community bias here?
Sure. I mean, I think there are 2 things to keep in mind, and these overlap very much with what Eric was talking about what type of evidence is used to facilitate a gang prosecution. One thing to keep in mind is gang databases, the use of gang databases, and the other is online government surveillance. So with respect to gang databases, it's clear for decades, maybe even beginning with California, that jurisdictions nationwide have begun to or long been maintaining databases of individuals that they believe are connected to gangs, right? So this was first in hard copy. I remember reading about California would keep little index cards in file cabinets on each individual. Now, today, with the advent of technology, we have searchable online computerized databases, but that these databases can also be analyzed using AI, algorithms, artificial intelligence, right? And so these databases are predicated on the notion that gangs and gang members can be identified by certain common cultural or social indicia or identifier. So those cultural factors or aspects such as clothing that's worn by an individual, or the language that an individual uses, in particular slang words, right? Particular graffiti markings or other written markings that might reflect a gang. Dances, right? So if we've heard of the Crip Walk, right? People will say, oh, if you do the Crip Walk, right, you're either endorsing or part of the gang. The use of hand signs or the throwing of hand signs, and then neighborhoods and communities and associations. So where you live might be a factor that indicates that you're in a gang, right? And then most recently, as Eric and I talk about in the book, music preferences, right? So gangster rap or any of the more modern subgenres, offshoots of gangster rap, right? All of those quite common cultural or social indicators, right, are used as evidence that an individual is a member of a gang or associated a gang. Of course, the problem is that many individuals who are not a part of a gang may use or adopt or embrace these same behaviors. So I certainly know of plenty of law-abiding men who tell me that, you know, if they're out and about in the community, they've been looked at funnily or oddly by police or other men if they're wearing a certain color in a certain place, as if, oh, are you a gang member, right? And I've heard of kids who are on the same sports team. So apropos to your comment, Emily, right? Kids who are on the same sports team making up their own hand signs for team members, right? School officials learn about this and decide that that group of student athletes is a gang, right? And they pose a danger to the school community, right? And so kids have been disciplined for that, either suspended or expelled. But what we see is that police are finding or concluding that these particular behaviors or conducts, right, are sufficient basis to put someone in a gang. And we know that recent studies of California's gang database, CalGang, right, indicated that these databases can be highly unreliable, even to the absurd, right? So I think more than 40 children under the age of 12 months were found to be included in CalGang.
Yeah.
I mean, that's ludicrous. That is
some of whom were supposed to have revealed their own gang affiliation.
Yes,
Linguistically surprising. Yeah.
Yeah, right? Completely absurd. Okay. So we have the existence of these gang databases, which today are even more powerful because they're searchable, right? And law enforcement can run algorithms on them to decide, you know, more particular pieces of information. But that also relates to massive online surveillance. So police, in particular gang units, but police nationwide have officers sitting in their offices, right, online and searching either social media spaces or online content sharing platforms, right, looking for connections between individuals who are allegedly gang members, looking for language and conversations that might be reflective of gang activity or potential gang activity, so they claim, right? The problem is we know that much of the behavior on social media and online, right, is filled with hyperbole and arrogance and deception, much like rap music. And much of this online behavior is actually quite normal for all individuals, law-abiding individuals and non-law-abiding individuals, right? And in some respects, for the young, it may be perfectly innocent and developmentally appropriate behavior, but police are going out of their way to monitor this behavior, right? Decide what they believe is criminal activity or follow up leads. And in particular, we see this happening with minority communities and individuals. And for our purposes, in thinking about rap and gangs, right, they are selectively targeting individuals or communities that supposedly come out of high crime neighborhoods or gang infested neighborhoods, right? And so I think the final thing to keep in mind is it's important to understand that many ordinary citizens or those who are not familiar with the legal system think that the criminal justice system and its various elements, right, are race neutral, right? Race plays no part in the decisions and the outcomes. Our decision makers are objective and they are unbiased. But this is a complete fallacy. It's a complete fiction, right? The rules maybe today are race neutral, but as applied, right, they are highly racialized, right? Decision makers come with their implicit bias, right? Police, prosecutors, judges, jurors, policymakers all bring their, both their express, but maybe unspoken bias, but also their implicit or unconscious bias. And so whether they know it or not, they're bringing that to their decision making. And we really think that's a significant problem with respect to gang prosecutions. So there are other aspects of the system I could talk about, but I'll stop there for now.
No, I'm really glad you brought up the point of like the baked in subjectivity, right? Like whether a person's movements look furtive
Yes.
or whether they look ordinary, whether a person's associations are suspicious. Like I said, like a bunch of 14-year-old white girl volleyball players can spit all the gangster rap lyrics they want, and nobody is going to make assumptions based on that. Read into that as we will. I have a hard time believing there are still people out there who don't think the criminal justice system is massively racially biased. It's really, you're probably right, but it's astonishing to me that.
I mean, it's astonishing to me too, but I think they think, oh, everybody can be objective. Everybody's trained to be objective and they're aware of their biases and they can control their biases, right? When you give them the data, they look a little more shocked and they'll sort of revert to the, well, it's those black and brown people who commit all the crimes. And so it's not racially biased. It's just.
They're more guilty.
Yes.
Yikes, that is a whole other panel discussion.
Correct.
But it's real.
I was actually hoping Brandon was supposed to be here with us today, and unfortunately he couldn't make it. But his case is kind of an amazing case study in what can happen to a young person who is interfacing with this machine. And I think, Andrea, you had kindly volunteered to walk us through Brandon's case. Others should feel free to jump in with details. But can you tell us what happened to Brandon?
Sure. So Brandon Duncan, and we should also mention his cohort, Aaron Harvey, both of them. Right? One was arrested on the basis of his rap lyrics, and the other based on social media and online postings. Right, but both of these gentlemen were charged by San Diego prosecutors with essentially actively promoting or endorsing gang activities, right? So this is California's gang statute, which is quite broad, right? And please, John or Eric, weigh in as well. But most people expect that those individuals who are going to be prosecuted under this statute are active gang members who have individually or collectively committed crimes on behalf of the gang and benefit from the gang activities, right? San Diego prosecutors charged quite a number of people with gang activity, and as part of that, they charged Brandon and Aaron, right? And Brandon's alleged connection was that he was an aspiring rap artist who also worked another job, right? Had a family, but he wrote lyrics that either sort of supported or endorsed this particular gang. There is no allegation and no evidence that he was involved in any gang activities,
or
that
knew
he was
about
a
them,
member of the gang,
Yep.
that he committed any crime,
Nope.
right? All his allegedly criminal conduct was essentially writing these lyrics that either endorsed or supported or promoted the gang. And that was a benefit to the gang and a benefit to him in his rap career.
And that was one of my favorite parts of that case, and I say that absolutely sarcastically. But I believe, and John, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that the statute, it's 182.5, allows essentially prosecutors to charge you so that you carry the whole weight of a crime if you endorsed or supported gang activity, but also if you benefited from gang activity. And one of the arguments that I recall was that prosecutors made the argument that he benefited from gang violence because it promoted him and his style of music, and he benefited in the form of increased street cred. I mean, that was essentially what it was. So
benefit, they call it, yeah.
What's that?
Reputational benefit.
Reputational benefit. I think they tried to go down the road of it could have helped him with album sales or record sales, but then it turned out that he gave those out for free. So that didn't work. So it was that idea that, yeah, there was a reputational benefit, and that gave prosecutors just enough room to go after him. And so then he sat in prison for months before a judge finally called it for what it was and released him.
So,
Right.
Go ahead, John. No, go ahead, John.
No, I mean, that is the Brandon Duncan case is kind of one of these landmark cases of prosecutorial and law enforcement overreach. And in that case, they used the Penal Code section 182.5, which is also the same charge that's being used against Draco or Daryl Caldwell, in a Los Angeles Superior Court right now. This is a charge that prior to Brandon's case really was almost never used. It was a law that didn't even make it through the legislature because there was so many problems with it, and it actually ended up being passed by the ballot because the legislative analysts kept sending it back saying, you know, there's constitutional problems here. So it's on the books, but it's really not been directed at people. And San Diego, I think, was a test case, but the problem and the error they made was being very upfront about why they were prosecuting Brandon Duncan, right? They came out and said, well, it's not just music. Do you see what hear what he's talking about? I think they said his album cover or CD cover has a gun on it. You know, really like, and it's shocking, right? The idea that, you know, all of us grow up and have this, or may have this relationship to art, the idea of art, that we can create, that we can express ourselves. But that's a privilege that's denied, you know, young Black and brown people, the idea that they are capable of actually creating art, right? And so whatever they create has to be something related to criminal conduct. It has to be something gang related. And so that was the most, you know, egregious case that I've seen, or at least it's been in the media, relating to the use of gang laws and prosecutions in California. And you know, that's interestingly enough in the Draco case, there was a murder that took place, and there was other people that were charged in the murder. Nobody ever claimed Draco was directly involved, encouraging it, you know, firing a gun, anything like that. He was just present. But none of the murderers got that charge, just Draco.
Yeah, John, I actually want to back you up for a second because I want to formally introduce the Draco case.
Okay.
From Brendan's case.
I just got a little excited.
I know, I'm excited too, but I also know that our audience is not as like totally deep in the Draco case as our panel.
Emily, can I raise one other point about Brandon's case before we move on? Right, so it's important, right? Brandon and Aaron, they're both arrested and they sit in jail for months, right? And they actually have to affirmatively file a motion to dismiss the charges, right? Which has to be litigated. So they have to essentially prove to the court, which I think early on was quite skeptical of the charges, but they have to prove to the court that there's no legal basis for this indictment, right? And so they were able to do that. So they're quite fortunate. They're also quite fortunate because they had resources available to them to then file a civil rights, a federal civil rights claim, right? To actually reinforce the proposition that the prosecutors here, right, acted outside the bounds of the law, and that they are due or should be entitled to some financial compensation for the harm that was brought upon them. That case lingered for a while in the federal system. Ultimately, they were able to settle it with the San Diego County, so that's a positive, but they had to sit and experience this incarceration and this frivolous charge for months and go through that. So it was only through, I mean, I think the force of their attorneys advocating on their behalf and in the state and federal system.
And I just want to emphasize, like, these are young people with massive potential, creative potential, academic potential. I think Aaron Harvey is now a scholar, an underground scholar at Berkeley, UC Berkeley. And thinking about the specific targeting of those young people who have the most fertile creative minds and who are actually acting upon their dreams and on their desires to create, I think, and that's the case with Draco too. It's a particularly virulent type of oppression to go after the kids who are trying to create a portrait of the world through art.
And it's a trap, right? And it's a kind of trap that's set for them, because essentially we collectively demand that type of content, right? And so they are, but we consume it, and we offer this as a legitimate way to achieve upward mobility in communities where that is particularly hard to come by. And so by setting up this demand for this type of content. Creating this pathway and then slamming the door like this, yeah, it's particularly frightening and disturbing.
Yeah, these are the kids who are recording music, not robbing a convenience store. So we should be rewarding the recording of music.
They're the poets from high school. You were not
exactly. The kid drawing on their jeans.
Yes.
That kid. Okay, John, this case is such, a landmark case that's happening right now and unfolding in real time. And I want to talk about it. I want you to tell us all the details, but also kind of frame this up as Brandon and Aaron just got a settlement from the County of San Diego for what was done to them, the months of their lives that were stolen. And it's very interesting to me because Draco has been in solitary confinement now, fighting this case for, I think, over a year. Is that right? He's been, he's been in tortuous conditions.
If you recall, the reason he was placed in solitary is also pretty fascinating.
And I want you to get into that. I'm not going to, there's no spoilers from me on that one. But I want to talk about what's happening to him, the story of his trial, of the police obsession that led to it. What's really interesting about his case is no one's alleging that he actually held a gun or that he committed any violent crime personally. We all agree that he was like present, hiding under the dashboard of his car when a shooting happened. And yet he's been fighting for his life and in solitary confinement. And this is something that is far more egregious than anything, I have to say, that was done to Brandon or Aaron. And I want to think about this, not just in the context of this individual case, but in the context of the LA DA election that's happening right now, and whether LA County is going to have to pay out a massive settlement next year when we are moving into an environment where Jackie Lacey's competitors have affirmed that they would not be using gang enhancements in this manner. So can you walk us through the whole mess?
I don't think we have enough time to go through the whole mess, but I can give a broad overview, right? So, Daryl Caldwell, Draco, I actually didn't know of him before actually Eric reached out to me and said, hey, there's this guy that's getting totally screwed down in Los Angeles. Do you know somebody that can help him? And I said, I don't really know anybody that's done a lot of work with the rap lyrics issue, but I'll consult with his attorney. And then just the attorney happened to be 90 years old, and his rap music and social media experience was probably a little bit less than us, I would say. It's fair to say. And so I ended up coming in on the case after reading the grand jury transcripts and realizing whenever you're approached about a case, you always hear one story and then you get into the evidence and you're like, that's a little bit different than what you told me. But in this case, it really was that outrageous to see the way they prosecuted him. I mean, he was charged, he was indicted through a grand jury for capital murder, which is basically you can get the death penalty, and the death penalty wasn't taken off the table until I think 3 months before the first trial, which was in May of 2019. So he was sitting in custody with potential death liability. Then he was also charged with conspiracy to commit murder based on this totally interesting theory that a rap beef, which there was another Los Angeles rapper named RJ who had been pretty prominent, and then I think things had slowed down in his career, but I think he's kind of coming back up now a bit. And so him and Draco was kind of the young cat coming up, and he was pretty hot, and like he was kind of the voice of LA at that point. He was the one that was breaking through. There's a lot of it's pretty well known in LA now. That he has essentially changed the game as far as the style of rap, and he has many imitators now that he's been in custody, because basically he hasn't been able to make music, and so other people are taking his style and his manner and repackaging it, and he's sitting in custody. But there's a lot of music journalists and people who had written about Draco and say he's the next big thing, he's about to blow up. and the police, come and arrest him and charge him with capital murder. So this rap beef is their guiding theory as to why he should be involved in this case, was that him and RJ had been, RJ made some sneak diss songs, which are like subliminal. It's not really calling out the person by name, but, writing a verse that people will infer from that he's referring to Draco. And so, Draco actually didn't even get involved. He was doing his own thing. RJ made a couple more songs, didn't do anything, and then he made a response song. And the prosecution and law enforcement theory was that Draco was so upset over this little rap beef that wasn't even really a rap beef, that he decided to go and kill him. And that's why he went to the party on the night where this other shooting took place. And mind you, at this party, this was like this little warehouse party out in Carson, where the chances of RJ being were non-existent, right? He would make a fair amount of money to appear at a party. This was not that party. He would he'd play at clubs or whatever. I think he was touring with somebody big. I can't remember, but I saw it on social media recently. But that was their theory, and that's how we ended up having Eric testify. And Eric testified about the history and the use of rap beefs for marketing purposes, really. And Eric can follow up on this, but since the beginning of rap, there's been battle rap, and there's been beefs as ways to boost each other up. And Eric talked about how, I think it was the beef between Drake and Pusha T like a year or two ago. And, if you actually look, all the search volume for each of them, just skyrocketed when this beef's going on, not due to any new music or anything. So, somehow the law enforcement and the prosecution just really decided they wanted Draco for this case. And they already knew. It was from the beginning. They had somebody who was a friend of Draco's who had decided to testify. He had taken basically a leniency package to testify against everybody. And he was just, he was in the car with Draco and was clear as day as to what had happened. The shooting broke out. Him and Draco duck under the seat. Mm-hmm. And what happened was, this is LA, and Draco's has his group of friends and rappers that are called alternately Too Greedy or Stink Team. And some of the rappers are actually, pretty good. Some of them need a little bit of work, but there's some of them that are actually even outside of Draco have had some local success. It's not quite national yet, but they're starting to break through. So what's interesting about Draco and his group of friends is that it's a place where the normal rules of LA gang culture were kind of put aside. So within his friend group and rap group, Too Greedy Stink Team, there was members of warring factions of Bloods and Crips and different neighborhoods that on the streets were sworn enemies and rivals, but being part of this I was gonna say movement, but that's what the music was at that point. It was really breaking out in like 2015, 2016. People put that aside, and so by the prosecution's evidence, he was there that night with people who were both Crips and Bloods, and then a young man who happened to be a member of a pretty prominent and large and powerful Blood gang showed up, and two of the people who were members of pretty, likewise large and powerful Crip gangs shot him and killed him. And, that's a terrible tragedy, but that tragedy didn't have anything to do with Draco. And so, the lead detective in this case, who's gained his own notoriety through the media and through some of the things that have happened, is an individual named Detective Hardiman. And he just became very interested. in Draco. And by interested, I'll say that I received 4 terabytes of discovery in this case. They executed like 70 search warrants, pulled down every piece of social media, rap lyrics, everything that was, it was a very thorough investigation. But they knew who the shooters were. They knew who the killers were. But this was all.
That's actually something I want to highlight, is that like they knew the 2 people who had actually pulled the trigger, and they put off prosecuting those 2 people for a year while they listened to rap lyrics, trying to find a lyric that would connect Draco to this incident, which is like from a public safety perspective, really wild.
And over the course of this, if I'm not mistaken, RJ, the alleged target who was not actually there, repeatedly said that he did not believe Draco had anything to do with, any plot to assassinate him. Right, John? Is that correct?
That's correct. I mean, it was. I don't think nobody. It seemed like to people, and maybe this is something getting into the bias, but also into like your life experience and exposure. Like those of us who grew up listening to hip hop and following hip hop culture understand rap beef, understand the way that can really highlight artists or bring them up by battling against somebody else. But I think, and that can be an innocent, if kind of crazy explanation is, in my trying to be sympathetic towards the police and prosecutors, or can be a little bit hard at times. Maybe they just had no idea that this is how the culture and the.
I don't know, John. I grew up like Waylon Jennings, and I can figure it out.
Yeah, but there's also a thing where, everybody, police and prosecutors, they love a high-profile case, right? It's a target, it's a mark. One thing we observed when we were back in Compton a few months ago was when you walk into the courthouse, there are these bulletins all over the ground floor, and I think they were in the elevators too. And I was like, I've never seen, crime bulletins here before. And then I get closer and read it. And it's all about this, there was this shooting or something that happened, or with a pretty big LA rapper named YG. His car was involved. He wasn't involved, but his car was involved in some shooting that happened in South Central Los Angeles. And so this was a police bulletin looking for information about it. And so, it's interesting that the one bulletin that shows up there and is plastered everywhere is for the rapper YG, sorry. And, there's a human instinct element to it. Like people, why do we watch celebrity news? That impacts police. They're like, this is cool. I don't, but it's crazy, right? Like that.
Actually, John, you've opened the door.
Okay. Somebody else jump through it now.
No. I'm gonna keep bothering all of you about this.
Okay.
There's two things I really want to touch on. One thing I just want to highlight really quickly for our audience is that when John is talking about his case, and when we're talking about all of these prosecutions, we're not just talking about charges that wouldn't be charges but for the existence of a gang. I mean, a song is not a crime unless the prosecutor says you're a gang member and it's a gang song. But we're also talking about a suspension of due process. We're talking about if I was charged with a homicide that was not a gang homicide, you wouldn't be able to admit evidence of like everything bad my friends ever did. But in the gang context, there's all this stuff that would be illegal to admit normally, would be considered unfair and violate due process unless you're in a gang. So the whole process gets kind of rigged toward the prosecution, who then gets a longer sentencing enhancement if they can prove the gang charge. And then there's also like spirals out into like different conditions of confinement for people who are convicted of gang offenses, and different conditions on release, like telling a kid he can't be around his dad, like injunctions and things like that. So I wanted to just flag that for our audience. But I wanted, what you had opened the door to, John, was the human element and the way in which enforcement in this context creates this weird intimacy between the police officers who are chasing down the bad guys and the people who are trying to live their lives under this kind of surveillance. It's particularly personal for me because the case that mattered the most to me in my life and the case that made me a public defender for life was the case of a young person who didn't have a violent bone in his body, really sweet kid, who had made an offhand joke. The cops in his neighborhood, who were gang enforcement cops, he lived in Baldwin Village, which is also called the Jungles in Los Angeles, and the gang enforcement unit there is particularly intense. He'd been stopped with a toy gun, and the police had been really angry that it wasn't a real gun, and he'd laughed at them for making the mistake. He'd made fun of Officer Washington. I'll never forget Rainey in Washington. The officers, this case was 15 years ago, you guys. He made fun of that really bad team of cops for making this mistake, and they had it in for him for the next year. They stopped him for everything. And when they finally got a chance to pin a homicide on him, and this is a homicide where we had about 12 witnesses who'd seen him somewhere else at the time, uninvolved. And all of the victims, all the people who were shot at, had seen someone else do the shooting. Police literally intimidated another young person, a 15-year-old, into IDing my client because they wanted to nail him for something. And that is the kind of like completely unprofessional, completely weird, deeply human, but like in the worst possible way, dynamic that develops in this type of policing. And I'm hoping that each of you could talk a bit about what gang enforcement policing does to a community and what it's like to live under those conditions and what kind of cases this creates.
I'll be brief. It's at least from my perspective, and this is a kind of new to me. I'm not an attorney. I'm not former police. I came at this really through the rap music angle, and then through that, I had all kinds of exposure to the criminal justice system. And I think what surprises me so much and what I find deeply concerning is the extent to which, with very little transparency or accountability, police, even individual officers, as you note, who maybe just have a score to settle, are able to stigmatize entire communities with the allegation that they are members of a gang, even when the criteria for establishing that, are laughably vague and broad. And so what you see is entire communities that have been painted with these broad strokes. And as a result of that, and I think Andrea mentioned algorithms going into these databases. Well, those algorithms are often used to allocate police resources, right? And so all of a sudden, you see gang police targeting these areas and then using the numbers in these databases in order to openly surveil as well as covertly these communities. What research tells us is that gang units are often not particularly effective at prevention. They don't spend a lot of time learning about the communities themselves. Too often, they do the lazier police work of watching YouTube and listening to SoundCloud and looking for opportunities to say something as ridiculous as the Stink Team, this well-known group, on the cover of the LA Times or the music section of the LA Times, that is actually a criminal street gang, that this rap collective, this rap group, and I see it all the time, that to me is fundamentally unfair at the artistic level, the First Amendment level, but it's also interfering with people's abilities just to live their everyday lives because there's this constant looming threat that's not even that hidden.
So I think, we have to recognize this is a bit tongue-in-cheek, but from a socio-cultural perspective, it gives us gangster rap, right? What does this type of policing do? It gives us this new, right, artistic form, and today more, modern offshoots. But if we put that to the side, I think what does it do to the actual individuals in their community? From a socio-legal perspective, studies routinely demonstrate that this type of hyper-aggressive gang policing, militarized policing, socializes and conditions youth including very young children as well as adults, to have a negative perception of law enforcement and the criminal justice system, right? To distrust law enforcement at every turn, right? And that perception is then manifested in tense and angry conversations with the police, right? When there are police-citizen interactions, right? It's manifested in flight from the police. It's manifested in physical resistance when police try and detain or arrest an individual, right? If what your experience is hyper-aggressive, hyper-violence policing, you can expect to be fearful of what the consequences are going to be to you if you have to submit to, or you're forced to submit to, law enforcement, right? And of course, as Eric just alluded to, and Emily, your story tells, that pisses police off, right? And worsens the interaction. So I think one individual and communal impact, right, is that it just amplifies community distrust of law enforcement, and it amplifies police aggression and misconduct when they are out in the streets trying to do their jobs. And it results in physical and social and emotional harms to individuals and communities.
And to follow up on that, I think, we're having this whole conversation about the rise of militarization and gang policing, but going directly alongside that is plummeting violent crime in this country, plummeting gang crime. And as it's all gone down, they have all of these officers and departments and resources now being directed out. And the problem, if you don't have a crime, if you don't have violence,
you manufacture it.
I think
I mean, that's Draco, right? It's like and it's funny because there's all these. They did a bunch of what are called Perkins operations, which is where they put an informant in the cell with everybody that was even remotely involved with this case. And the informant would ask, or somehow Draco would come up, and whoever it was across the board was like, "Oh yeah, no, he don't bang. He doesn't bang." Right?
Yeah.
It's like everybody who knew him, and in the on the like street level context knows he's not a gangbanger, knows he doesn't even do the kind of conduct that's is traditional in Los Angeles street gangs. So. It's interesting that there's a fun, not a fun, but these communities have been living under occupation, right? I think that's the simplest way to describe it, right? When you go out your door and the police car is rolling by and you want to go get some milk and you're being watched and the car is following you.
Helicopters, yep.
Yeah.
And so forth, and you get stopped. And so say you're walking to the store with your cousin. Say your cousin is a gangster. Now you have what's called an FI, a field identification card, that's been created for you that says associating on this date with so-and-so who is, maybe a documented gangster. And so now you're a gang associate. And so you walk a couple times more to the store, or you're just standing out front. You don't have you lose the right to stand in front of your house and hang out with your friends without you ending up in a report or an FI card saying, congregating with other ex-neighborhood gang affiliates, right? An affiliate is such a broad and vague term that everybody falls into that category. And so it just creates this environment that I think everybody's addressing where, the reason there's problems with the police in these communities is it's a two-way street, right? You have to take responsibility. Everybody's got to take responsibility, right? The young people are being forced to, bear the burden, the brunt of taking responsibility. No, you shouldn't walk to the store with your cousin because he's a gangster, and that's why we did that to you. But the police also need to start taking a step back, slowing things down, and saying, is this really what we should be doing as law enforcement? Should we be targeting people who are just trying to live their lives? Violent crime, we understand it. There's good, reasons, public policy, society, safety reasons. But when you're going after people and you're tearing apart communities and you're targeting people, people lose housing. People lose housing all the time over this. You become a gang member. You're arrested for something minor. You get a gang enhancement. All of a sudden, it's a felony. All of a sudden, it's a strike, right? It decimates communities, and some communities even believe that, you know, it just creates this and like I've heard that people like believe that it's the city and the developers that want to push all the Black people out so they can gentrify, redevelop, make it nice for all of out here, all of the tech people, and that's how what they believe the enforcement's about. But in which, you know, I don't know that there's any evidence of that, but like when you're like, why are you being treated like this? Like, why is my life like this? There's got to be a reason. People look for reasons, and there's not. It's really like to deal with this on a day-to-day basis and to have to explain to people, you know, sitting in a jail cell. Well, yeah, but I mean, here it says your cousin is so-and-so, and here it says your uncle is so-and-so, and or your friend from high school that you grew up with since you, and this is especially true, like you grew up with these people. You know, these are the people you played everything from Little League to and on up. These are your peer group. And so now hanging out with them is gang related. It's so devastating to communities and to people, and to live under that. Just the crushing weight of it on young people just is you know, I don't know how we put people through that and expect them not to be upset, sad, mad, angry, frustrated. And then out of that, if they try to produce music, expressing that,
Right.
you're right back in it.
John, that's the perfect depressing note for me to draw us to a close on.
Yeah, thanks, John.
I want to thank you all for being with us here today. To any of our audience members who want to reach out for more information or to find out more about these issues, I'm sure we are all happy to be a resource. I hope you all cover the Draco case because John has a hearing coming up on
Monday.
Hey!
I gotta get back to go to LA.
So thank you all for being here. We really, really appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
And that's all we have. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Take care.